Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. Now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Well, it's been another busy week, especially in Israeli politics, since we last met last Wednesday. Basically, I said last week that although there was quite a lot of optimism that this government would at least last until later in the year, maybe after the Jewish holidays in September, I said that anything could happen. And don't forget, all it needs is for one member of Knesset with such a tenuous balance between the coalition and opposition to basically decide to leave for personal reasons, for ideological reasons, maybe a mixture of both. Interestingly enough, I think I read a couple of weeks ago, Amit Segal, who is known to be one of the more astute and very closely connected political commentators, journalists in Israel, said that usually the ones who make the least noise are the ones you've got to be worried about. Where there's noise, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, that's not usually a great threat, but sometimes these things come out of left field, and certainly that's what we heard after weeks or months of worrying about members of Yamina, which one is going to be the next one to jump after Idit Silman left a while ago, leaving the coalition down to a bare minimum of 60. Everyone was wondering, would it be Nir Orbach? Would it be Kara? Would it be this one? Would it be Shaked? Would it be a combination? Perhaps one of the other right-wing parties? Interestingly enough, it actually came from the left wing. That's certainly not where most commentators thought would be a threat, because as we know, especially the left of Israel, the Meretz Party, Labour Party, this is the first time they've been in government for quite a while, and perhaps with the political constellation as it is, this may well be their last chance for a while, because the right wing certainly ideologically has a very significant majority in the Knesset. I think we did the maths at one point, between 70 and 80 seats. So certainly it seemed to be very little interest in anyone on the left wing. I'm not putting at this moment the Ram, the Islamist Arab Party, but on the left wing of the Zionist political map, one didn't see many threats. But out of left field came an Arab woman, Zowabi from Meretz, who out of nowhere, seemingly, last Thursday, declared that she's leaving the coalition. Now, as one can imagine, this sent everything into into a real tailspin, because that basically meant that the government was down to 59, and not to say all the opposition was to 61, but certainly now it would seem that they potentially had the numbers not to replace the government through an official vote of no confidence, but to vote for the dispersal of Knesset law, which would mean the Knesset would disperse and we'd go to elections within 3 months. So everyone was already starting to set their calendars. 3 months would have meant August, which is the vacation. A lot of people are aware no one likes to hold elections then. So we were talking about September, perhaps in the heart of the Jewish holidays. So people are already starting to discuss dates. But then after doing the rounds of the Israeli mainstream media, Zowabi said, this is long time in coming, not happy about what's going on with the Palestinians, with the Arab Street, the funeral for the Al Jazeera journalist, what happened during Ramadan on the Temple Mount, etc., etc. And she made a point, kept on saying that when they said, can you reverse your decision? She said, you've got to understand, when an Arab woman makes up her mind, she holds to it. Well, apparently that's not necessarily true, as a lot of commentators mentioned after, because it seemed slowly but slowly she was coming down from a tree. Initially, she wouldn't be pushed on how she would vote on a law of dispersal of Knesset, whether she would vote against the government, even though she would not consider herself legally bound. Of course, it matters very much if you vote against the government, if you don't turn up for votes or don't vote for or against, or if you vote for. I mean, with such a balance, every little detail matters. So she went from, I haven't decided how I'm going to vote yet, to I don't think I'm going to vote to disperse the Knesset, to maybe I will vote for the coalition on important votes like that. And eventually more and more pressure was put on her from various figures. The most important elements appeared to be Yair Lapid, who now seems to be the person directly working with her. But more importantly, at least from her point of view, a lot of mayors of Arab towns and municipalities came forward and said, now is not the time to bring down a government. We haven't yet received the budgets that were promised to us. And the point was made again and again that you may not like this government, but the alternative would be Netanyahu, would be Itamar Ben Gvir. The message that kept being put out was that, can you imagine Itamar Ben Gvir as the Minister of Internal Security? As one can imagine, the Minister of Internal Security is one not necessarily desired by the Arab street, and one can imagine someone as far right as Itamar Ben Gvir certainly would cause chills to many in the Arab public. So there was a lot of pressure put on her, and lo and behold, after the weekend, she declared that she was returning to the government. Interestingly enough, she held a press conference, and it wasn't her party chairman, Nitzan Horowitz, next to her. It was Yair Lapid with a load of mayors of Arab towns and municipalities around the country saying that we support her. Don't forget, Zowabi herself comes from the Arab municipality system, and there was talk of her perhaps going back to that at some point. So basically that fire seemed to be put out, at least for now, although we saw this week she didn't turn up for a lot of votes. Even though she said she was returning to the coalition, she didn't vote with the coalition. But on the whole, coalition managed to pass most of its votes this week on Monday and Wednesday without her help. But basically, this was supposed to be the end of the government. People were already starting, as I said, to look at their calendars to see when the elections could take place. And now we're back, or seemingly back, in a position where we're back to the 60-60 again. An interesting other issue that came up this week, I think we touched on it briefly, was this law that would supply 2/3 of the tuition fees for those Israelis who serve in combat units to then go and study in further education after their studies, called Madim Limudim, from uniform to studies. And there was a lot of pressure on the Likud, especially to vote for this, because obviously it would be a lot more difficult for the Ram party to pass. And even if the Ram party would decide to vote for it, then it would again be 60-60, and the law would not pass. There was a lot of pressure from IDF veterans groups, from all sorts of different lobbying groups that basically said this is an important law, this should be beyond politics. And that was the message that certainly came out from the coalition in general, and Defense Minister Benny Gantz, that this was his particular pet project in particular. And at one point, it seemed like there was going to be quite a rebellion from a number of Likud MKs who said that this shouldn't be an issue. It's not going to bring down the government anyway, so we can't hurt our soldiers in their time of need, et cetera, et cetera. So it did seem like there was a certain rebellion. Netanyahu was certainly put pressure on by his ultra-Orthodox opposition partners, who said, well, if you're going to vote for coalition laws, then maybe we can also put up some laws as well. And that put a lot of pressure, especially at a time where the ultra-Orthodox are being wooed behind the scenes by the coalition. It's not necessarily going to happen. I certainly don't believe. And we've seen today that Finance Minister Avigdor Lieberman put out some things in a budget which he's writing for next year. There's quite a few particular parts of it which would hurt the Haredi sector. So I don't see the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox party, joining. But certainly this was something in the end that Netanyahu was back and forth on, remarkably or not, depends how you view it, the Likud faction meeting, which discussed how it was going to vote, was recorded and released with one of the more prominent members, Miri Regev, who we know was a minister in the past of culture and a few other portfolios she held. And she made remarkable comments, which were, as one can imagine, immediately lapped up by the coalition, which said that we shouldn't get stomach aches, as she put it, over issues to do with the IDF or to do with rape victims or even the disabled. Our main goal is to bring down the government. There's been a big debate over exactly what is the opposition's role. Is the opposition's role in any society, in any democracy, just to bring down the government, or is it just to push the government, voting with it when it thinks it's right, but pushing it, making sure that it stays faithful to what they think is best for the country, but not automatically, reflexively voting against it at every single matter. And that's pretty much where the Likud has been from 95 to 99%. But these comments clearly embarrassed the Likud to a point where it was decided that they would vote for this law. But then when the Joint Arab List, who wanted to embarrass the Likud, their so-called partners in the opposition, decided to make it a vote of no confidence, which is their right to do, the Likud could no longer vote for it. But what they did do is they decided not to vote against it. So they all left the chamber, which allowed the law to pass by a massive majority. I think it was 50-something to 6, those 6 being the Joint Arab List. So that passed. Actually, I should go back a step. The Likud decided to vote for it after Benny Gantz had decided to up from 2/3 tuition being paid to 3/4. The Likud, in response to the embarrassment that was shown about voting against, seemingly voting against IDF combat veterans, they said that we're prepared to put up a law for 100% of tuition, which is nothing that they ever put up when they were in government. But they wanted to try and embarrass the opposition, but that wasn't sticking. So when Benny Gantz offered, to up from 2/3 to 3/4, then they liked everyone could claim a little bit of a victory. That they could say, well, we got more for the IDF veterans, and the coalition said, well, we could pass this law. So in the end, that it certainly embarrassed certain people in the Likud, Regev being one of them. But at the end of the day, it was passed, and certainly it's an important law to pass, and the coalition probably takes more credit than the opposition at this point. As the coalition was celebrating quite a lot of wins this week, another crisis took place today with the head of the, not the finance ministry, the economic committee, Michael Biton, basically decided he's no longer going to vote with the government because of what he claims are unfair reforms in public transport and agriculture. There's been a few reforms that have been tried or are being tried or even are underway and ongoing in this government. And two of the high-profile ones are agriculture, to try and open up the market, to try and open up the so-called monopolies that have been running it, with the raising of the prices for a lot of commodities, a lot of produce. Minister of Agriculture Oded Forer has certainly tried to push back against these strong lobbies, and Michael Biton is one that was identified as the lobby, as someone who could stand up for them, the farmers' lobby, the agriculturalists' lobby, and he said that he will not be bound by the government as long as this reform goes through. He also had a pop at Transportation Minister Merav Michaeli because of her reform of public transport. And he basically said he's not going to vote with the government. He will vote at this point with the government on laws of no confidence, because obviously that could take down the government. But at the moment, it remains to be seen exactly what's going to happen there. In today's votes, he did not show up for the votes, and he's claimed that he's closed his economic committee until further notice. He's making a lot of noise. A lot of people have accused him of basically being a populist, of trying to take advantage of this situation. But again, it really just goes back to what I've been saying, that any one MK who wants to build a career, who maybe wants to get a promise from someone in the opposition, maybe Likud, of a nicely placed position on their list, or maybe a ministry next time, or maybe they have other aspirations. Maybe it is ideological in some, but what is clear is that this government is really putting out fires. There are people in Yamina who just see it as a matter of days. They're already starting to say that maybe it's time to form an alternative government, to reach out to the Likud to see if it's possible to form an alternative government. I mean, there's nothing particularly new in that, but certainly with each crisis, the voices grow louder. And just finally, this week, there was a relatively historic an event where the Turkish foreign minister came to Israel, the first in many, many years. He went to the Palestinian Authority, he even went up to the Temple Mount. But today he held a meeting with Yair Lapid, and it's clear that the relations are going in the right direction. There was lots of talks of agreements. The Turks certainly need this, arguably more than the Israelis at this point. There wasn't specifics mentioned on the return of ambassadors. We haven't had ambassadors in each other's country for a number of years, I think since 2018. But certainly this visit is the highest profile visit by a Turkish politician for many, many years, especially after the crisis in relations that have been going back at least 13, 14 years. So that's certainly useful for the region. It remains to be seen exactly what will come out of it. In practical terms, Turkey wants to show that it's, that it's back in the sort of moderate camp, or at least showing its will towards that camp. Wants to be in America's good books. Wants to be part of Israel's natural gas projects with the Eastern Mediterranean, with countries like Cyprus and Greece. And Israel has an interest in regaining the relations with Turkey, which used to be one of the pillars, foundational pillars of peace and security in the region. So we'll see how that plays out, but certainly it was a very important week for Israel-Turkey relations. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on any of the issues I mentioned or anything else that's on your mind.
All right, thank you so much. The first question is from Daniel Pipes. Prime Minister Bennett has indicated that Biden has definitively kept the IRGC on the terrorism list. Can you please comment?
Yeah, this issue came up, I think, a couple of months ago, where there was leaks that the Americans were considering meeting a demand of Iran to return to the JCPOA, which was the removal of the Revolutionary Guards from the terrorist organization list of the State Department. When Israel heard about this, they went into, I'm sure Israel wasn't the only country, but certainly was one of the major players, went into full diplomatic drive, really pushing the Americans back on this, working in Congress, working with the Biden administration, showing how dangerous it was, even getting information out, showing the Americans of attempted assassinations, not just of Jewish and Israeli figures, but also Americans, and just showing some of the things that the Revolutionary Guards were involved in. And one of the major sort of turning points was when the Joint Chief of Staff, the head of the Joint Chief of Staff, the U.S. Army, backed this position that the Revolutionary Guards should not be taken off the terrorist list. So it did seem like there was a lot of momentum. Not to say a president couldn't go against their most senior military figure, but it would seem unlikely that such a figure would make such comments and then look weak as the politicians would take over. So it did seem that there was momentum against it. The Iranians are obviously livid about it. They're still making it one of their primary issues, but at the moment, the Americans seem to be standing firm, and the Israelis are certainly seeing this as a diplomatic gain. But we don't know exactly what the price will be paid if there should be returned to the JCPOA. And maybe they found, sometimes in diplomacy, they find a constructive way around it. by not taking them off the list, but doing something else similar, of a similar nature, that the Iranians can feel that they got a victory there. So at the moment, it seems that they are staying on the list. But if there is a return to the JCPOA, I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of compromises, let's say, given to the Iranians. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what those are.
Thank you so much. D. Rohr Strauss asks, do you have any insight about Flag Day with the new high security, which was just announced?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an annual event. I think last year was the first time that it was cancelled ever. Well, since it started. And there's been a lot of talk exactly, should it take place? Is it poking the eye of the Palestinians, of the extremists last year? If we remember, on that day, Hamas decided to launch rockets on Jerusalem, specifically on that day, and it was first rerouted and then basically cancelled. There was an event, I think, a few weeks later to try and compensate for that. But this year, there's been a lot of staunch support for it. Even someone like Omer Bar-Lev, who is the internal security minister, who certainly could not be accused of being overly right-wing, believes, as certainly more right-wing members do, that rerouting it or cancelling it would be a capitulation. And the Israeli security forces have sent a message to Hamas that if it plans to do anything like it did last year, it will be hit very solidly and powerfully in return. It does seem like the numbers will be limited somewhat. It won't be just open-ended as it has been in previous years. The biggest controversy, the biggest, let's say, controversial part of the march is relatively near the beginning, where it marches through Damascus Gate, through the Muslim quarter. Usually it goes off largely without incident. There are, sadly, amongst the thousands, if not tens of thousands of participants, a few people who shout racist or aggressive or violent chants towards some Arabs. But usually these things are relatively peaceful. But they are definitely seen as antagonistic from the Palestinian side. But at the moment, it has been given the go-ahead, and it seems like there's going to be one of the largest security operations in recent memory in Jerusalem on Sunday to make sure it passes off without incident.
Thank you so much. Michael Kerbel asks about the budget. Is there any possibility for getting a budget passed this year? No one passed last year, but with the coalition falling apart.
Right. When it passed last year, it had 61, and you need 61. At the moment, it has 60, which means it can't pass if everyone turns up and votes the way they're supposed to. So the budget is good until the end of 2022, and then it has to be passed 3 years until it goes out of date. In other words, 3 months, I should say. So as of the end of March, they will have had to pass this government if it survives that long. And that's a very big if, as I said earlier on. Then it would have to pass the budget by then. I don't see how it's going to, I don't think the government's going to last even long enough to do that. Finance Minister Victor Liebman is certainly trying to be optimistic, or at least trying to show that business as usual, and he has a plan, and he's working on the budget, and they're leaking parts of the budget every other day to show what would be part of it. But I see very, very little chance that this government will survive long enough even to pass a budget, but one never knows. I just don't see where that 61st member is supposed to come from.
Understood. And speaking of, with Zowabi and Meretz, sorry, what exactly do they get for staying with the coalition? Why would she come back after she left from?
As I said, I think it was a combination of factors. I think that she felt that she would probably have more support than she did. But the case was made quite powerfully, actually, especially in the Arab street, that however much you dislike this government, what's the alternative? The alternative is the opposition, is a return of Netanyahu, is perhaps Itamar Ben Gvir as a minister of internal security, as I said, which would really be a red flag for many Arabs. And basically what she had was or it seems like has come out of it, was released today, is in the original budget, there was something like 770 million shekels, which is about $250,000, something around that, maybe a bit less. Not $250,000, I should say, dollars that was supposed to be given to the Arab sector. It's something which has been promised for many, many different coalitions, but it was being held out by red tape, by bureaucracy, by differences of opinion. And it certainly seems that now that it is being pushed forward, for all sorts of things, for roads, infrastructure, for housing, for fighting violence and crime, which is something that affects all of Israelis, as we've seen in recent weeks, that the crime and violence in the Arab sector spills over to wider Israeli society. So it does seem that that was one of the issues that was worked out, and that's seen as one of the gains that member of Knesset Zowabi gained by this crisis. Let's not forget, I don't know if the question mentioned this, but this was not a revolt from the Meretz party as a whole. This was just one particular individual member of Knesset.
Thank you for making that distinction. Eric asked, can you please talk more about CNN claim that Israel killed the Al Jazeera journalist in a deliberate attack? IDF obviously rejects this report. Can you comment?
Yeah, I didn't read the whole CNN article. I read snippets of it and some of the reactions to it. First of all, what the Israeli authorities pointed out very early on is not a single Israeli was quoted. Official Israeli was quoted, and obviously Israel has a lot to say about it. Point out the fact that if this is all true that the Israelis did it, then why are the Palestinians not handing over the bullet, which would give pretty much all the information necessary to ascertain who exactly shot the journalist? Israel's not saying that it couldn't have been responsible, but the idea that it targeted the journalist is something which it thoroughly rejects. And basically the CNN report, although very lengthy, it basically relies on eyewitness testimony, and almost all of the eyewitnesses that they spoke to are rabidly anti-Israel. I saw an interesting report by honestreporting.com, which passed some of the interviewees in that particular report, and some of them have praised terrorism, praised the murder of Israelis as hardly the neutral observers that they were being portrayed. And there's no way of knowing that a bullet that lands anywhere is intentional. So the idea that they could prove that it was intentional, they brought in a ballistic expert. But again, someone who looked into the background of this ballistic expert could see how on many other occasions they've taken an extremely hostile line towards Israel. So again, not the impartial, neutral observer that was being written about in the CNN report. But basically, it all hinged on these eyewitness testimonies, and it basically said, well, Israel has not presented any evidence of its claim that there was a Palestinian shooting in a different direction. Well, it's very difficult for Israel to, Israel doesn't go in with a camera as it does these, a lot of the context was lost. That's what's very important. When they go in for these raids, they don't come in advance with a camera crew set up in all positions, filming what's going on and let everyone know about it. It's a very tense situation. You go in there to try and make arrests of terrorists who were involved in the murder of Israelis, as we saw in the weeks before that. 17 Israelis were brutally murdered in terrorist attacks. So Israel has been going into places like Jenin, where a lot of the terrorists came out of, to try and make arrests of those who were behind the operations, who guided the operations, who supplied, who incited towards the operations. And when it did so, unfortunately, this journalist was killed. And it's clear from all videos and anyone who's ever been involved in these operations that they're very tense situations. Palestinians coming out of everywhere, shooting in every direction. They don't aim particularly, and there's a lot of videos that have been put out. So the idea that you could immediately just lump this on Israel by giving some not very impartial, neutral people is absurd, but unfortunately that is now the narrative out there. But the fact that they did not interview or give a voice to a single official Israeli position really just shows what the intention of this article was.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week.
Absolutely.
For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Sam Westrop in conversation with Daniel Hakikachu. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful day.